Welcome to American Ancestry Decoded. This is an investigative report titled The New York Indian Real Estate Chief Maringamus. Section 1, The Colored Man at the Wigwam. In 1858, a local surveyor named George W. Tuttle sat down to write a letter about patent boundaries in Blooming Grove, Orange County, New York. This wasn't a manifesto or a historical essay. This was a landman doing survey things. He writes that about half a mile below the village of Washingtonville on the northwestern bank of Murderers Creek sits a house owned by a colored man named Henry Page. But this isn't just any house, nor any site, and Surveyor Tuttle says this plainly. This is the location of the wigwam of Chief Maringamus. Chief Maringamus wasn't some forgotten figure. He was a known indigenous leader, a grantor in early land transfers, and his wigwam, his residence, was so established and so well known that colonial surveyors used it as a legal boundary marker for the Rip Van Dam patent, which was a 3,000-acre colonial land grant. When these counties were being carved up by European investors and land syndicates, they weren't mapping untouched wilderness. They were actually drawing lines from known indigenous strongholds and then recording them in their own legal and banking documents. So this isn't lore. This is based on ledger. And in 1858, over 150 years after first contact in New York, the land was still occupied and still inhabited, but not by light-skinned European settlers, by a colored man. Surveyor Tuttle wasn't trying to expose anything. He was just doing his job, and in doing it, he dropped something priceless. A direct, verifiable link between Chief Maringamus and his sovereign territory and a living descendant on that same ground in 1858. Section 2, Castle over Orange County. Maringamus didn't just have a wigwam on the floodplain. According to the History of Orange County, New York, a book published in 1881 by local civic elites, Maringamus actually had a castle. They use that exact word. His castle likely sat on the northern end of the Schunemuck Mountains, a ridge towering above the Otterkill Valley. From there, he could oversee the Hudson Highlands to the east, which included pre-existing stronghold West Point, the future home of the United States Military Academy. So this was real strategic architecture. Here's what takes it further. The name Maringamus probably was a title. That means the wigwam and the castle weren't some personal homes. These were actual offices of power. He was likely a territorial sovereign, anchoring a legal geography that even European colonial land patents had to reference and respect. The presence of the West Point Military Academy is likely no coincidence. This entire region, from the Schunemuck to the Hudson, was a historic command point. Section 3, Real Estate Dealers. Here's where we start seeing how the indigenous land got overwritten, not just taken. From 1671 to 1739, nearly a dozen land transactions occur under variations of the name Maringamus, Maringamak, Maringaman, Mosignic, and more. These deeds include massive tracts in modern Orange, Rockland, and Ulster counties. And these weren't just isolated deals. No, these Indians were actually wheeling and dealing within the colonial system. Colonial corporations were filing preemptive land patents, legal blueprints for future seizure. So alongside the violence came the paper. And they had a literal stock market created based on land patents in the so-called frontier zone. Here are some of the spellings in the land patent. 1671, Mossing Porterum sells land between Haverstraw and Hackensack, New Jersey. We got a Mosignic, 1696. We have a Maringamak, 1703, around the Cheesecox boundaries. As late as 1739, we have our Maringaman, who testifies in court to certain boundaries. So Maringamus was likely not a personal name. It was a position, a title of leadership. And that's why we have these variations of the name showing up in major land deals throughout the 16 and 1700s. So what we see here was that a colonial strategy wasn't just simply to use brute force, but rather to use a premeditated system that would convert the land title into the European system long before the people had been displaced and removed. Section 4, hostages for land. Sarah Wells in the Belmont Line. In 1701, Governor Lord Belmont of New York described this area west of the Hudson Highlands as a wilderness. Yet at the same time, colonial land patents were being filed in this very region, overlapping with our man Maringamus's domain. Among these patents was the Wawayanda patent, staked by a European trustee named Christopher Den. And what was one of his instruments for securing his stake in the Wawayanda patent? Why, a young orphan girl named Sarah Wells. Where you see orphan, I see hostage indigenous child. Wells was likely a custodial hostage of an indigenous elite family. Placed under European guardianship of this man named Den, she was then physically led into the Otter Kill territory by Indian guides to do what? Claim Den's land by proxy. That's right. This was the rule they played by. Use indigenous children that you've removed from their kin. Give them English names and Christian custodial sponsors. Then redeploy them to anchor land patents as, I quote, resilient orphans that settled the wild land. In other words, by having a resilient orphan on your title, you got higher likelihood of winning the land under the patent. Sarah Wells was likely connected to the bloodlines of the clan of Maringamus. There's no way she was alone. This strategy of orphan hostage deployment mirrors what the Dawes Act would later institutionalize. And what about this governor, Lord Belmont? Well, he was part of the same dynastic trust line as the Belmonts of later fame. Banker August Belmont during the Civil War, as well as the horse race, the Belmont Stakes. Section 5, on the losing side of the Revolutionary War. This land was not forgotten during the American Revolution. Minnesink and other Orange County terrain became a battlefield. Joseph Brandt, a Mohawk war chief, educated in British schools and fluent in both indigenous and Masonic codes, i.e. a hostage indigenous bloodline, led coordinated raids in 1779. Brandt is typically framed as a loyalist ally of the British, but he appears more like a sovereignty enforcer. He's really someone trying to prevent total erasure of various indigenous claims that would happen under the banner of this new American liberty. By 1783, many of the land claims under Maringamus were now scorched, renegotiated, and defaulted in the settler hands under the guise of the Revolutionary War victory. Section 6, post-revolution relabeling and reclassification. This process went hand in hand with something else, changing identities. Maringamus, a sovereign steward of a known jurisdiction, becomes a footnote. His descendants aren't listed as heirs. They become colored, maybe free men of color, perhaps Negro. Henry Page, living on the same land in 1858, is not recognized as an Indian or indigenous. He's labeled a black or colored. He's actually legal, but he's second class, officially relabeled, culturally cut off, ancestry receding. This is not a clerical accident. It was a policy of gradual, generational erasure. Some families were displaced by force. Others sold under duress. Others still converted into the settler economy, taxed in the debt, and then foreclosed upon. Regardless, once labeled black, they lost the legal standing as indigenous Indian heirs. By the 1890s, the Dawes Act would formalize this pattern. Section 7, economic value of the holdings of Maringamus. This land was not a backwater. It was prime real estate, including silver mines. Orange County's GDP in 2024 was $24 billion. That's right, $24 billion in economic activity per year in Orange County. Assuming that the area of Maringamus was 20% of Orange County, That means he would be generating $5 billion a year to his tribe. When we look at the real estate value of that land, it would sell for at least $5 billion today. I'll say that again. You got an annual income of $5 billion to spread across the tribe, and you're sitting on real estate that's valued at least $5 billion. See, there were these silver mines there in the Hudson Highlands in the Wawayanda region, and they were already active. I know this because the Dutch records refer to miners and syndicates as early as 1702. And just for the record, the Dutch were not known as expert miners. Just 1,000 tons of that silver mined over a 50-year period would be worth another $1 billion today. Section 8, next steps to investigate. The story isn't just about the past. It's a roadmap for recovery. Here are some further questions to guide investigation. What happened to the descendants of Henry Page? Can we find a chain of title from Maringamus to Page? Are there paper relics of all of these titles and patents? This isn't just academic. For many, this could be personal. For Black Americans today discovering their indigenous roots, stories like this are evidence. Your ancestors didn't vanish. They were converted, relabeled, taxed, and pushed, but they did not disappear. This has been a production of American Ancestry Decoded. Remembrance conquers oblivion. Subscribe at the website for more forensic recoveries of cultural memory.